Leah Knight is Associate Professor of Early Modern Literature in the Department of English at Brock University. She is the co-creator with Wendy Wall of the Pulter Project, a digital compendium of Hester Pulter's poetry, which earned the MLA's 2020 Prize for Collaborative Bibliographical or Archival Scholarship, and the 2019 Prize for the Best Project in Digital Scholarship, New Media or Art from the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women and Gender. Leah's current projects include the expansion of the Pulter Project and a new sole-authored site entitled Fragments of a Renaissance Reader, Text Lives of Early Modern Women. And her presentation today is titled Hester Pulter's Alter Ego, or How Hester Pulter Read the Book of Esther.
Since its rediscovery, at the end of the 20th century, Hester Pulter's single manuscript volume has been analyzed in a growing body of scholarship, but Pulter herself remains indistinct. What we know about her is mainly inferred from her verse, which is not perfectly faithful to the facts, as is only fair. Otherwise, we must extrapolate from what we know about the men in her life, especially her father, James Leigh, a high-ranking servant to James I, and her husband, Arthur, who also held various public offices, Justice of the Peace, Captain of the Militia, County Sheriff, and therefore is remembered in the public record in a way far less common for 17th century women. Likewise, among other records, Arthur's will survives in the National Archives. Pulter's, if she even wrote one, does not. In another form of public record, where one might expect evidence of a woman's accomplishments, Pulter flickers in and out of view, mostly out. The parish register that commemorates the baptism of 10 out of Pulter's 15 children never fails to record their father's name or status. Pulter, however, rarely appears. Only after 7 of her children were born, 4 were buried, and she had lived 21 years as matriarch of a prominent family in their tiny country parish did anyone mention Hester Pulter's motherhood in a baptismal record, here for her daughter Elizabeth. Pulter is also noticed when that same daughter died, not a year later. She remained on the radar in 1645 at her daughter Jane's death. But by the time her first son died in 1659, Pulter had faded from view, as Karen Britlin has recently highlighted. In this last record, space is made for her, then left blank. Somehow, the Christian name of a highly devout, high-status parishioner remained unknown to whoever created this half-hearted half-record. The ampersand and blank space act as a ghostly acknowledgement of her existence, but as often Pulter remains a poltergeist haunting history, barely but undeniably there, made legible by the material form of an official public silence and by the space created and occupied even by an absent name. But silence and absence can be chosen, not just imposed. Pulter's notable absence from and namelessness in such records is echoed seemingly at her behest in her own manuscript. When opened from one end, this volume reveals her verse. From the other, we read her unfinished romance. In each case, Pulter's name is missing from the front matter. At least, it is not witnessed by any contemporary hand. The romance is initially identified in a florid hand as written by the noble Hadassus, a reference to the biblical Hadassah, known to Christians from the Book of Esther. The next leaf sidles closer to Pulter's identity with the courtesy commonly accorded to a peer's daughter, the Right Honorable. But like the ampersand and blank space in the parish register, this attribution also trails off with a mere, etc. At the volume's other end, Pulter's poems are presented as breathed forth by the noble Hadassus. That same name appears a third time, but in a different hand at the top left of this leaf, where it is struck through with the last 2 letters erased. Like most scholars, I believe this hand is authorial. If we turn the page, another and quite different title appears, also in Pulter's hand, Hadassa's Chaste Fancies, being the fruit of solitary and many of them sad hours. Below, the same hand proffers a relevant couplet. Marvel not, my name's concealed. In being hid, it is revealed. The very absence of an authorial signature is thus credited with the paradoxical power of a speaking silence, a concealing that reveals, like the blank space in the record of her first son's death. Below that couplet, we see another awkwardly phrased title, apparently in another hand. Poems breathed forth by the Hadassus, Right Honorable. Further down, still another hand gives away the author's identity altogether. Lady Hester Pulter died, the latter end of March or beginning of April, 1678. This statement led scholars to identify Pulter as the book's author, with another tip coming from the gold lettering on the spine, Lady Hester Pulter's poems. The binding, however, postdates her death, as does evidently the note about when she died. In contrast, nothing about the manuscript as Pulter saw it identifies her so explicitly. The closest Pulter might have come to outing herself could be those honorific adjectives, right honorable and noble, which suggest her rank. Likewise, she might have approved her initials on yet another title page preceding her verse. But then again, this page might have remained blank throughout her lifetime. My point, all titles identifying Pulter, even peripherally, with initials or honorifics, might be posthumous. When she does name herself, it is as Hadassah. This is also true of an internal title page preceding her emblems. A second related point with consequences that I'll get to. In every case where the name Hadassah appears within the poetic text, it is spelled, as in the Bible, with a terminal H. In The Weeping Wish, a poem in Pulter's hand, the word does end with an S, but only to signal the possessive case. The conventional spelling is also used in two emblems in the main scribal hand. In emblem 28, she writes, "Let me ever have a splendent fame, or let me lose Hadassah, my loved name. Far better in oblivion live and die than to survive with these, the emblem's nasty exemplars, in infamy." In emblem 44, she longingly recounts the transformation of a burning phoenix into a kind of primal maternal principle. So doth the phoenix fan her gilded wings, till Phoebus' rays her gaudy feathers sings, which means singes. Then in that light in which she lives, she fries, a glorious virgin victim, thus she dies. Thus, though the fire her grosser part consumes, a principle is left which reassumes the azure, purple, scarlet, golden plumes which did adorn her gorgeous, gaudy mother. Thus they succeed and still exceed each other. Who would not such a blessed change explore, or who would such a change as this deplore? She wishfully takes the phoenix as an emblem of her future self. So I, being worn with sorrow, sin, and age, quite tired with acting in this scene and stage, would gladly my mortality lay by. Who then can say Hadassah here doth lie, when as my soul shall reascend above to God, the fount of life, light, joy, and love? Nor shall my scattered dust forgotten rest, but like the embryo in the phoenix nest, that word that nothing did create in vain shall re-inspire my dormant dust again, and from obscurity my atoms raise to sing in joy his everlasting praise. In both emblems invoking her biblical persona, the theme is how she should be remembered. She'd prefer oblivion to infamy and rejects wrong-headed memorials by mocking a mock epitaph, Hadassah here doth lie, as utterly mistaking the matter. She would or shall not lie anywhere such lying words could be carved, because her soul shall reascend above such lapidary spaces. Ironically, the word here, where she claims she will not be found, is materially conjoined with the manuscript that bodies forth the only substantial version of Pulter that appears to remain. In one way, at least, Pulter was not wrong about her scattered dust, her refuse, refusing to rest, forgotten. Instead, after centuries of silence, it has had new life breathed into it, and from obscurity, her atoms do rise to sing again. Her songs are remembered. The examples above show that Pulter spells her pseudonym with a terminal H or A, never with an S, except to signal the possessive case. This is true of usages in her own hand and the poems in the main scribal hand, which are uncorrected by her, although she otherwise makes corrections throughout the manuscript. True, In the opening title pages at the verse end, the terminal H on the pseudonym appears to be replaced by Pulter with the letter S. But that first apparent usage is cancelled, while the second usage clearly implies possessive phrasing. The poems are Hadassah's, chaste fancies. Yet all three other usages, in non-authorial hands at both ends of the volume, use the terminal S in the objective case. It seems vanishingly unlikely that Pulter approved a misspelling of her own alias in the title or titles of her only book. We should therefore suspect that the title pages with Hadassah's in the objective case were not approved by Pulter. My theory: Pulter named her verse collection Poems Breathed Forth by the Noble Hadassah. On what is now the first leaf of the verse, someone erringly copied Pulter's use of the possessive form instead. At her behest, the errant leaf was set aside, then found after her death among loose papers, of which others survive with the volume, and some of which were tipped in when it was bound, and the leaf was pasted in. Within Pulter's lifetime, however, after the removal of what is now that pasted in first leaf, someone was tasked with copying but correcting the title onto what is now the second leaf on the verse end. But this scribe not only repeated the spelling error, but compounded it by accidentally skipping the adjective noble, resulting in the unidiomatic phrase, the Hadassahs, which the scribe then tried to amend by adding the courtesy title, synonymous with the skipped adjective, but syntactically out of place. With this Hydra-like correction generating two errors in place of one, I propose that Pulter then abandoned the title's trope and pseudonym for the more straightforward title of the next leaf, Poems Written by the Right Honourable. And based on the hand and layout, I suspect she herself at some point added her initials. Perhaps as the dangers associated with being an outspoken royalist in England's civil wars dissipated, she felt more comfortable claiming her manuscript with something approaching her name. Elements of this process were repeated at the volume's other end, where the first mangled and misspelled leaf is similarly pasted in, and where the second leaf offers a similarly straightforward title, identifying her as the Right Honourable, etc. An ironic but authorized echo of her veiled appearance in the parish register. That's the material evidence for Pulter's alter ego. But what led this Protestant gentlewoman to identify with an ancient Hebrew queen in the first place? There is, of course, the etymological link between the English Hester or Esther and the Hebrew name Hadassah. According to the biblical book of Esther, a Jewish woman named Hadassah was chosen as the second wife of an ancient Persian king after he discarded the first for disobedience. The world being what it was, Hadassah was advised to hide her Jewish identity, even from her husband. The very act of concealing her name, then, is one affinity between Pulter and Hadassah. Pulter also wrote as a royalist at a time when that political stance was embattled, then subordinate, and finally a capital crime, not unlike Hadassah, navigating cultural conditions where Jewishness was often keyed to struggle, subordination, and genocide. The Book of Esther tells of the Persian king's plan to commit just such a slaughter. Esther, however, outs herself as she begs him to reverse his order. She asks, "How can I endure to see the evil that shall come to my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" The king, persuaded, instructs Esther and her uncle Mordecai to write ye for the Jews as it liketh you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. He thus offers Esther and Mordecai power over the most authoritative secular scripture in their world. They become the emperor's ghostwriters, working anonymously through the written word to change the course of history. By endorsing her writing with the king's ring, Esther could even be said to assume his identity, metaphorically, in a very material form of alias. It is thus clear how this heroine provided a model for Pulter, who lived when she wrote in unhappy isolation on a country estate as England's civil wars raged around her, driving family members apart and killing close relations, as well as her beloved king, while she was all but powerless to effect public change. She was practically impotent, not only as a woman in a patriarchy that refused women most forms of public authority, but also because she was frequently confined, not just to home, but to bed, Remember those 15 babies? In poignant contrast, Queen Esther, one of few biblical women, never identified as a woman, as a mother, woman, yes, mother, no, briefly but effectively held sway over the Persian Empire, overturning a fiat to destroy her people while engineering the execution of 75,000 others and the permanent commemoration of that massacre. Some of Pulter's poems make it clear that she longed for such shockingly effective political power. But where Esther appealed to a king, Pulter wrote to God to exact the kind of vengeance her heroine had penned into grisly action. In her 64th poem, for instance, Pulter prays for bloody blowback upon her enemies in a tone that is, perhaps, surprising for a titled gentlewoman writing from pastoral retirement. Great God, look on their pride and hear their boasts. Declare thyself alone the Lord of hosts. Confound their plots and cursed imagination that have almost destroyed this church and nation. For blood they thirst? Oh, let them be imbrued in one another's, that have oft bedewed with tears sad widows and poor orphans' eyes. Be deaf to theirs, as they were to their cries. As in their height they mercy ne'er would know, in their extremes no mercy to them show. In this passage, Pulter identifies the English royalist opposition with her deity's chosen people, oppressed on earth and awaiting divine reckoning. But while she knew how to bide her time, waiting was not altogether Esther's style. She also spoke up, acted decisively and publicly, and wrote authoritatively and memorably. All this is relatively unusual, even among exemplary scriptural females, as one recent scholar of the Book of Esther notes. Quote, unlike most other biblical women, Esther becomes a hero not by bearing children, but because of her words and actions. While Pulter quite heroically enacted the births of those 15 children and nursed almost all of them through illness and death, it might not have been in the motherly aspect of her identity that she could most meaningfully locate her heroism. Esther provided a model of a godly woman who did not derive her worth from a conventional, feminine, maternal behavior, and who enlarged the purview of female heroism from the private realm to the public, or blended them by rendering a woman's strong feelings for her extended family the basis of effective public political action. Esther also offered an example of a woman whose accomplishments derive from her powerful words, both spoken and written. Her anguished rhetorical questions enliven her sympathetic ethos, and she cleverly couches her requests in hypothetical conditions with which the king cannot but agree. If it please the king, and if I have favor in his sight, and if I be pleasing in his eyes. Susan Zaski sees the Book of Esther as a textbook in rhetoric for subalterns. It employs a female heroine to instruct a marginalized group in how best to speak in the dangerous rhetorical setting of the Persian court. Esther recommends a rhetoric that features both supplication and civil disobedience, that is at once ingratiating and condescending, that is equally conservative and radical. This characterization of Esther's rhetoric aptly encapsulates the complex rhetoric in many of Pulter's poems. She implores for God's mercy, while implying she has much to offer in return. To her human audience, she downplays her verse as a harmless pastime, while composing visions of cosmos-busting revolution. Politically, she may be seen as conservative in her royalism or radical in resisting the depredations of the parliamentary army. Most importantly, though, Esther was a model female writer, composing decrees that saved thousands, killed thousands more, and are still remembered and celebrated by her people. While Mordecai is first credited with writing in the king's name, it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded, here in chapter 8. Esther is credited for commemorating the Jewish vengeance. Esther the queen wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim, we hear in chapter 9. And although Mordecai distributes their writing, he sent the letters unto all the Jews, we hear. Both he and Esther appoint the days of Purim, and in the end, this work is attributed to Esther alone. Quote, the decree of Esther confirmed these matters, and it was written in the book. In the end, the Book of Esther emphasizes its heroine's lasting authority and efficacy as a writer. Hadassah thus offered Hester Pulter considerable inspiration. She was famed for her courage and capacity to speak truth to power as a member of an oppressed people, which women and women writers both were in early modern England. She lastingly transformed that people's future through the commemorative work enabled by her writing, as Pulter may have hoped her poems would do for the friends she often mentions. In those emblems where Pulter invokes her alias, she's concerned with whether and how she'll be remembered, an ironic concern for someone who went to such trouble to conceal her actual identity in the only volume that is now, against her best efforts, called hers. Yet even such concealing was, as her epigraph indicates, part of what helps to reveal Pulter's poetic identity as Hadassah. By appearing under the modest yet intriguing veil of an alias, her writing created space for us to reassemble her scattered dust from obscurity, and so to remember her, I hope, as she might have wanted. Thanks.